Welcome to the Two Disabled Dudes podcast. We believe life is about how we react. Welcome back. This is our fifth and final episode in our drug development series. This series has been a ton of fun, but it's also been a ton of work. Yes. It's been a great opportunity to connect with people who are experts in this space that we pretend to be experts in. These executives are super busy, so it's easy to think that they probably don't have time for us. But everyone was so open and generous with all of their time and knowledge.
Yeah, they were incredibly generous. This entire series starts with episode 143 and ends with this episode, number 147. So be sure to check them all out. Our guest today is an expert in taking drugs to market, and he shares his experience and expertise with us today. Please enjoy this conversation with Tim Walbert.
Welcome to the Two Disabled Dudes podcast.
Well, Sean, thanks so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here with
you. You prepared a top five for us. What is the category of your top five?
Certainly for my top five, I grew up in Philly, but I've been here in Chicago for over 20 years. And it's, what are the five most interesting things or things you have to do when you come to Chicago? So I'll walk through those. First, if you've ever watched WGN, no matter where you live around the country, you have to go to Wrigley Field. You got to see a Cubs game. You can't miss it. Second is, if you're a sports fan, you got to catch a Bears or Bulls game. Chicago's a great sports town. The next place you got to go after that, you got to go to the Sears Tower. We call it the Willis Tower, but, we grew up East Coast. We knew it as the Sears Tower. I think it's now the second tallest building in the U.S. It's a great place to get a view across the west side and the north and south sides of Chicago. Beautiful place to visit. And speaking of seeing the water, you got to go on an architectural tour. They have these boats that go up and down the Chicago River. You get to see all the fascinating architecture. Chicago's known for its historic architecture. Some of the biggest architectural firms started out here, and it just gives you an amazing perspective going up and down the river as they tell you a little bit about the history of Chicago, the architecture, and how that really spawned here. And last, as Kyle, you got to come visit us at Horizon. So got to come into the office, spend some time with us, and anytime you're in town, got to have you in.
Thank you. No, that's a wonderful list. I've been to Chicago a couple times, been to the Horizon office a couple times, and I have to admit that is a great thing to see, and appreciate all your other points too for anyone who visits Chicago.
I'd like to just pick a bone before we get too far into it. Tim, you and I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, but I was able to go to your Chicago office 3 years ago, maybe, or something like that. Anyway, what I noticed, besides all the top accolades you guys get for being a phenomenal company to work for, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
But I noticed Kyle's photo a couple times blown up, like life-size posters. And I'm a little offended that I never saw my photo.
Well, I think there's an opportunity. With that beard, people aren't going to recognize Kyle anymore, so we might have to replace it, and it's time for your picture, Sean.
There we go. Okay. All right. That's cool.
Absolutely.
So, Tim, we want to allow you a little time to do a self-intro, just a little history about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Kyle. So Horizon, we're in our 13th year now. We're here in the Chicagoland. We're also based out of Dublin, Ireland. We've got folks in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and also out in South San Francisco. So now we're we have over 1,600 employees. We are focused on rare disease drug development and commercialization, and we're a company that started off really small in the mid to late 2000s and have grown a lot over the years. Had the pleasure of working with you, Kyle, and being very much involved in the FA community, which we remain today. I'm also on the chairman of a company called Execure, which is developing a medicine for Friedreich's ataxia. So really happy to be remaining involved in the FA community, and it's just a pleasure to be here with you. But with Horizon, we've had tremendous success with a number of different rare diseases over the last number of years. Last year, we were able to bring a medicine to market called pt5 for a very rare eye disease that can lead to serious pain, disfigurement, double vision, and even patients going blind. So that's been a great success, helping many patients. And we have a deep pipeline of other rare disease medicines that we hope to bring out over the next coming years. So we're really committed to the rare disease space. I also have a rare disease myself, as does my 14-year-old son. So that's definitely brings different perspective to go through, as you both know. So definitely invested personally and professionally in this community.
You mentioned all the successes of Horizon and the new drugs coming out. What would you say is the most rewarding part of your job as CEO of Horizon?
When I go on Instagram and I see stories of patients who have had no options for years and are posting. If you look at our medicine pt5 we launched last year, people are, going from being in their home, not being able to work, to getting the life back, being able to see, and people don't appreciate that if you have double vision, you can't get up and walk around your house safely. You can't even go outside your house, and when so many of our medicines are able to make a huge difference in the lives of patients, it just gives you hope that you can continue to do with other medicines, and hopefully sometime down the road even help my son in a better way. And it's I think that's the most satisfying aspect is reading those stories, seeing the pictures. As you know, pictures say much more than words and emails can. So that's really brings a lot of joy to me. But we're never done. The best medicines don't help everyone, so we have to keep fighting at this.
Tim, I'm curious. You talked a little bit about the history of Horizon. Would you mind going back a little bit further and tell us a little bit about you? Like, how did you get into the world of pharma? Where did that come from, or where did that originate for you?
Sure. So I originally got into sales in the pharmaceutical industry through a good friend of mine. His dad was a sales representative with a company called Wyeth. It was soon after that I started experiencing some of the early symptoms of one of my two diseases, and it just brought a lot of perspective, and then moved inside into marketing and other commercial roles, and found I could have much broader impact. And I've always really enjoyed the science. My sister was a pre-med major, my twin sister, and my older sister's a nurse, and my dad's a Lutheran minister, so always seeing patients in hospitals. So it was always something that was in the family. And my sister went to work at Merck, and I worked at Wyeth, which is now part of Pfizer. So got in, really enjoyed the marketing aspect, and really learning more about clinical trials and that whole process that you go through, and how these medicines can make such a big difference to a variety of different patients. So I've done things from cardiovascular disease to just general osteoarthritis, or as your joints age, to rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease where your body attacks itself and destroys your own joints, and developing medicines like Humira that can make a big difference in patients' lives. And I've had the benefit of not only developing and bringing a medicine like Humira to market, but right when it came out, I started taking it myself. So I've taken that for now over 18 years myself. So kind of not only being able to develop something, but personally benefit. We developed and got a medicine called Duexis approved, which I've taken ever since it was approved and launched in 2012. So I've had the benefit of taking a number of the medicines that we've actually developed ourselves. So just really enjoy the whole drug development aspect, being able to bring new medicines to market and get them to as many people as possible.
Well, you're obviously the perfect candidate, if you will, for wrapping up what we've dubbed our drug development series. And the whole conversation today is going to focus on that hurdle of taking an approved drug to market. And it just sounds like you obviously you come to the table with a lot of experience. So again, I'm honored that you carved some time out of your day to be with us. I want to start that conversation with one question.
Sure.
Do you remember, or can you talk about the feelings that existed that first time you helped lead the charge of going to market or getting that FDA approval?
Sure. So I've been involved in a number of them. I think the one that brought the most meaning to me was Humira, since I had such personal involvement having an autoimmune disease and a rare disease. Unfortunately, that Humira has benefited both of them. And I still remember we got it approved on December 31st of 2002. And this was New Year's Eve, and it was around midnight, 12:15 in the morning, and walking around the building, the last person there, and looked up and saw the sign that said Humira now approved. And I get goosebumps thinking about
Wow.
it now. And, when you're able to kind of go through that whole process of developing a medicine and then get it approved, and New Year's Eve and everyone's out celebrating and you're in the office at midnight and you look up and you just see that first sign that this is real and we're going to be able to get it out to patients, and knowing that even myself, I was going to be able to start taking the medicine was a pretty special moment for me.
You talk about the emotions and, the big moment, I love that. And one of the reasons I bet that it's so satisfying is that there's so much work and detail and everything that goes into it. Can you tell us maybe what some of the requirements are that you guys have to meet to get over that hurdle to approval?
Well, there's so much that is unknown and unsaid about the drug development process. There is, the basic chemistry and biology to identify a medicine. So typically when you're discovering medicines, there are many, many different targets identified and failures along the way, just in the chemistry and the biology process. And you can spend years identifying a target. And then from there, you have to do laboratory tests and some animal tests. And once you've got a molecule that is deemed safe there, then you move into phase 1 studies, which are human studies. And we start off by doing them typically in lower doses to see and make sure in healthy volunteers. So people come in, volunteer to look at the drug and see how the safety of that drug looks like. Then we move on to trials called phase 2A, where you're actually looking at the efficacy of the drug. So not only are you measuring safety, but you start looking at, does it actually work? That's the first step. And typically that's done for shorter periods of time. So in you may, in a case of Humira, you may study this in 20, 30 people, measure it for, let's say, 3 months. Whereas, when you do the next step trials, you're going to do for longer periods of time. So you might study it for 3 months, 20, 30 patients, do some measuring of both safety but efficacy. And if you're successful there, then you can move into what's called a phase 2B study. And that's where you do a little bit larger numbers, but also you start studying it versus placebo. And if you're successful there, then you have to meet with FDA or EMA or whatever regulatory authority to get their buy-in that, hey, these endpoints are real evidence that the drug is in fact working versus something that could happen by random chance. So you have a lot of statistical work and development work that really looks at that whole process. But also you have to make sure that you're able to manufacture the drug successfully. So you have to go through a whole parallel process where you're doing formulation development, making sure that how is the drug delivered? Is it what we call a small molecule medicines that delivered? It's a pill. or in the case of a medicine like Actimmune, which has been used in the FA community, that's something that is injected. So there's also medicines that are infused directly into patients. So what is that route of delivery that is going to best allow the medicine to benefit a patient? And then you have to go through a series of processes and repeat tests to make sure that that is a reproducible process, and also one that can scale up so you can study it in larger patients. So while you're doing the clinical work, you're also measuring and making sure that each lot of that manufacturing material is consistent from lot to lot. And once you have all that done, you're meeting with the regulatory authorities, and then you have pivotal trials or phase 3 trials. That's where, in most cases, you have to do 2 trials that are larger, that also are placebo-controlled, to be able to show that your drug is different than what is standard of care, and in enough patients to show that you're safe both short and long term. So instead of maybe a 12-week or 3-month study, you might be studying six months or 12 months. And even once people stop taking the medicine, then you in fact follow them and track those patients and see how they're doing 6 months later and even longer. Because FDA typically wants at least 100 patients out to 1 year with safety data and 300 patients out to at least 6 months. Then you have to bring all that data together along with a replicatable manufacturing process and submit that into the agency, where they're going to take anywhere from 6 to 12 months to review that process. And for a typical medicine, this can take anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And when you look at the success rate, you can have several $1 billion spent on average for every one medicine that gets approved. That's a typical drug development process. And then maybe we can talk a little bit more about how that might be different for patients with rare diseases.
Yeah, specifically in the approval with the FDA, are the rules like flexible or different for rare disease?
Well, they often are. So there's a number of steps that can be taken. So first is we have what's called orphan drug designation. What that allows you is the ability to have more frequent interactions with the FDA. It gives you some patent protection and regulatory protection so that you have enough time. So anywhere from 7 years of protection so that you have the time to kind of recoup your investment in the market. And it also gives you an ability to, depending again on the disease. So if you look at a disease like Friedreich's ataxia where nothing's approved, it's going to be treated differently than if you have a disease where you might have a rare disease, but there's 3, 4, 5 different medicines that are approved for it. So if you have a disease where there's 3 medicines approved, then you're going to have to probably do longer studies or do studies with larger number of patients because you actually have on-market medicines. If you don't have approved medicines and you're going into an area where nothing's ever worked, well, you don't necessarily have the right endpoint. So a real challenge, like in the case of Friedreich's ataxia, is there's a lot of different ways to measure whether a drug is effective or not. And part of the challenge in rare diseases is being able to come up with what is the best endpoint or measure of success that the regulatory authorities like the FDA are going to accept that is evidence for approval. So sometimes it may be a surrogate marker. So measuring frataxin, measuring certain different patient-reported outcomes. In other diseases, they want to see what is the outcome. So is it a 7-minute walking test? Is it survival in a different population, like in oncology? Is it a progression-free survival? So how long does the disease stay away in a particular cancer? So it really depends on the disease you're going into. So if you use Friedreich's ataxia as an example where nothing else has been approved, then often instead of in that phase 3 process, you can do a very important phase 2 trial that has a placebo arm, and that can be treated as a pivotal or a trial that you can submit to the agencies. So you may not have to do the full 100 patients for a year, because sometimes you have populations where there's only 2 or 5 or 10,000 patients So it would take years to be able to get enough of those patients into a clinical trial. So it really depends on the disease, and it's really negotiating with the FDA and then understanding from, if FA is a great example, where you work with FARA or you work with the David Lynch, where you get the key investigators together and define what is standard of care, what are the best measurements to use, what is most important to the patients, and then you design a clinical trial that can define that as best as possible over a period of time. So if you have a disease that's acute, you may be able to do that in a month or 3 months. Whereas if you have a chronic disease like FA, they may want to see data out 1 year or 2 years to make sure that that early success that you might have in a month or two actually is still successful out to 1 year. So all these different factors really go into it. There's a specific office at FDA, the Orphan Drug Office, and they are much more willing to help you define accelerated pathways to bring the medicine to market. If there's nothing that's ever been approved, and you have a novel medicine, you can get a number of different designations. They can give you fast track that comes along with that orphan drug designation, which means instead of taking up to a year to review the medicine, they might do that in 6 months to get it to patients even faster. Breakthrough therapy is another one where it affords you a lot more opportunity to interact with the FDA and to really best bring a medicine to market as fast as possible.
We know that the patient voice has to become focus of the FDA and regulators recently, right? I mean, 5-10 years, it's really come into fine focus that the patient voice is one of the key factors. So in this final stage of approval, right before it goes to market, how would you say the patient voice factors into the process?
Well, I think the patient voice matters early in the drug development process because without understanding the journey that a patient goes through, it's hard to come up with the best treatment. So if you have a medicine for Friedreich's ataxia, the first thing we have to do is sit down with patients like you guys and understand, what were your first symptoms? What was the course of the disease? What treatments did you use? What interventions came up? So I think the most important thing we can do in developing rare disease medicines is listening to patients, understanding that journey from diagnosis for symptoms through to where they are today.
Yep.
And that's where natural history and being able to understand what the natural history is of the disease so you can best see where a drug fits in. And the best way to find that out is talking directly to patients. And then the next step is, if you look at drug development, often FDA calls an advisory committee meeting where they will bring together a panel of external experts to get feedback on that medicine from the community. So they'll ask people like, if it's FA, a David Lynch, but they'll also have a patient representative on that actually represents the advocacy community, the patient community. So there's been a big effort at FDA. I think there's been a much more concerted effort at the company level. But even as you transition through the process to get approval, what is the best way to bring that to patients? We think as a traditional way of just going and talking to a doctor, you tell them and they'll talk to a patient. And that's an antiquated way of doing it. So what we do is we talk to the patients. And you can do that through advocacy groups like FARA, or you can do it also directly in interacting with patients and having patient advisory boards, so that every step of the way, from how we educate patients to how we communicate with patients for the medicines where we market to rare diseases, all of our materials that we use to talk to patients, we have a patient advisory board review them before we even send them out to make sure we're not sending the wrong messages. Because what we may assume is something that's going to communicate the benefits of medicine might not actually make sense from a patient's perspective. So I think the more we as companies can do to hear what's important to a patient is we may be talking about the main endpoint of a trial. What the patient wants to know is, how do I feel and how much difference did it make in my ability to do things we call activities of daily living? Those things are more important to me as a patient than maybe understanding an endpoint on a piece of paper.
Yep.
Having those kind of regular with patients is critical to me in making sure that medicines can best get to them in the end.
I want to be sensitive with this question,
Sure.
but Tim, I'm curious. We know, and we've talked to other people in the industry too, where an endpoint might be significant but not translate well with the patient, or may not mean much.
Exactly.
So from your perspective as CEO or just an executive leader, how do you balance the two? I guess when you're pursuing what you know to be a viable treatment or therapy on one end, but maybe is a hard message to quote unquote sell to patient. How do you balance those two sometimes parallel goals and sometimes contradictory kind of pursuits?
It's a great point, Sean. And there's a couple examples I know of. I was friends with a person who got a medicine approved for an autoimmune disease, and his company did, and it showed statistical significance, but didn't happen to work in the subset of patients who were the most likely patients to get the disease. So that brings a real challenge. And they did more studies and tried to show what are the particular benefits in the population most likely to actually benefit versus just anyone who went into the trial. Because oftentimes a clinical trial has to have very specific criteria so that you can really measure the endpoints accurately. And that criteria might not match up perfectly with what an average patient might be experiencing. I think it's so important when we design trials is that we not only design and have those endpoints that are going to meet the regulatory aspect, but we're doing patient-reported outcomes so that we put into our trials, activities of daily living. We do SF-36, which is a measure of quality of life, so that you may have a situation where you have a medicine that meets the statistical endpoint, but doesn't make a difference in any of the quality of life measures to a patient. So then you have to ask yourself a different question of, okay, what is the meaning of the medicine? And I think what's improved is the FDA is going to look at it that way. And they're going to want to understand not only is it statistically significant, but is it clinically meaningful? Yeah. And I think that's where, as we develop medicines, we have a responsibility to understand that difference. And that's why I think patient-reported outcomes are so important, so that we can actually see that not only does it statistically work, but is it clinically meaningful to you as a patient?
Tim, earlier, I know I'm kind of switching gears a little bit. We've got a pretty good explanation now on the process, and earlier talked about all the different stages of study and approval and back and forth with regulatory agencies. If we were to go back to the marketing piece, let's assume for a minute whether you think Humira or one of the other drugs that you've personally been involved with, or we hypothetically say we got a cure or a treatment for FA. At what point does a company like Horizon begin the marketing job, so to speak? Because on December 31st, when you saw that sign, Humira is approved, I imagine it wasn't at the pharmacy the next day. At what point do you begin that process? And I think another question with that is how much risk is involved.
And Sean, that is a very good example. There was a medicine rejected by FDA advisory committee meeting. I think it was last week for a medicine Pfizer's been developing for about 20 years for a certain autoimmune condition. And unfortunately, it had significant adverse events that didn't overcome the efficacy that was seen. And they probably spent, I wouldn't be surprised if they spent over $1 billion developing that medicine. And in the end, it's not going to make it to market. So there is a lot at risk. And that is a key tenet of innovation is it's risk. And what typically occurs is early on in the process, you want to understand what is the disease like? What is that patient journey? So we will engage with advocacy groups. We will engage with opinion leaders and do processes to understand the disease. And then as we learn more about the medicine, as we see the potential for the medicine, then we will start doing education efforts. So we will go out, talk to a number of different physicians around the country, around the world, really educating that this mechanism of action has some potential in this particular disease, so that there's broad awareness of the disease and the potential treatment, so that when you get that approval, then you move into the step of really selling that medicine, the attributes, the benefits it can bring to a patient. So you will see companies putting tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars at risk before a medicine is approved. If you look at Tepezza, which we got approved January 21st of 2020, we had probably spent between clinical and commercial activities several $100 million, even for a smaller company like ours. So it is, you put a lot of money at risk, but ultimately it's really what's required to educate the community, educate the patients, and make sure that there's a real understanding of the medicine, so that when it is approved, it's used in the best way by the right patients. You'll see companies start that process typically in phase 2. So you could see people spending 18, 24 months, even longer of that pre-commercial effort and educational effort. So it's a lot of time and money at risk.
So once all that commercial work has started and the ball is rolling, if we think about an approved drug, how long would you say the average time frame is to go from that final stamp of approval to doctors prescribing it?
Well, so in the case of Tepezza, which we got approved, we were able to get it to the distributors in about 2 weeks. And then infusions began probably within about a month or so. Wow. So that process went relatively quickly.
Sure.
But if you have a medicine that is infused into patients, there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that there's places for it to be infused, that process is well understood. And if you've done that process up front, then you can accelerate that time after approval. So it's in our industry, I think companies are very good at that process to get it to the pharmacies or get it to the distributors to make sure that medicine can get out to patients quite rapidly. But it also brings in the other process that we all deal with. As I'm a patient, you guys are patients. It's called managed care and payers. So in the perfect world, medicine gets approved. It has a dramatic benefit in a number of patients, but payers going to step in and say, you know what? If we take 30, 60, 90 days to verify things, we've saved some money. So payers step in to verify and make sure that it's being used in the right patients based on the right indications or based on their own criteria. Some payers, even if a medicine is the only one, in a rare disease, they have policies that say we will never reimburse in the first 6 months, just a way to save money and buy some time. So there are a lot of hurdles that the typical rare disease medicine, it can take anywhere from 60 to 90 days to get through that reimbursement process, because rare disease medicine costs a lot of money to develop and then are generally higher cost in a much smaller population of patients, when payers, managed care folks are going to want to put it through a lot of process to ensure it's going to the right patients. So it's not just the shipping it out and getting it ready to be taken. It's the reimbursement process that becomes the next phase that really makes a big difference for patients.
Speaking of cost to a patient, you mentioned several times, billions of dollars, hundreds of millions all put into developing these drugs. What are all the factors that go into setting a price for a drug?
So there's a lot of work that's done. We typically have external folks that will step in and help you understand what is the market size, what is the cost that you've invested, what does it cost to make your medicine? So you may have a medicine that costs several $100s to manufacture each vial. And if it costs several $100 to make a vial, it's going to cost more than that. So a lot of factors like the cost of manufacturing, the cost to develop it, the cost to educate folks go into that pricing. And if you have 10 million patients or a million patients, you can spread that cost over a lot more people. If you're in a rare disease, let's say 10,000 patients, then you have to recoup that investment in a much smaller population. And the prices are higher in the rare disease space. I think it's really important that companies not only understand the pricing, but also understand what is the net pricing. Because in the US, we have a system where if a drug costs $1,000, 54% of that goes to everyone else except for the drug company before costs. So if it's $1,000, there's $460 that goes back to the drug company. And then they take their cost out of it. And the net of that is ultimately what profit is. In our industry, you have managed care and rebates and payers. And then you have out-of-pocket costs that have been passed on to the patients. So a tool that was used years ago to differentiate between medicines called a copay is now used as a profit stream. So that drug that costs $1,000, they may charge $300 or $400 to the patient, even if they got a discount from that drug from the pharmaceutical manufacturer. And then the specialty pharmacies got to make their money, and the distributors got to make their money, and the payers have to make their money. So there's a lot that goes into pricing. It's not just the total or gross pricing of a medicine. It's all those people that get a piece of that pie. And then from a Horizon perspective, what we have to understand is, what is the system going to charge the patient? Our philosophy is always, we want to make sure that out-of-pocket cost is not impeding on the patient. So we essentially pick up when it's commercial plans, non-government plans, we actually will pick up the vast majority of that out-of-pocket cost to patients. And that becomes essentially just another discount to the medicine. So it's not as simple as setting a price. There's all these other factors that go in that are quite complex. And then you get into Medicaid and Medicare, which bring on much different pricing dynamics where you can't support the patient. Those are things that aren't allowed. And you bring in external foundations that come in and try to support patients and help. So it is quite complex, and it's something that is confusing to physicians, it's confusing to patients, even for those of us who run these companies. These things change all the time. They instituted rules a year ago saying, well, no longer are your copays going to go against your deductibles. So that way, they make it harder for companies and patients by saying, you know what, only your medical costs would count against your deductible. So patients are on the hook for those out-of-pocket costs. So there's a lot of things that are going into the market that make it quite difficult, confusing, and we as companies have to factor all that into pricing. So as you can see, and it's not a simple answer, Kyle. Yeah. There is a lot that goes into it, and I think companies are trying to be responsible. I think everyone is trying to kind of make their piece of it, and the key thing is, in my view, is making sure that the patient gets their medicine at the lowest cost possible.
Right. So, Tim, when it comes to marketing a product and doing ads, there seems to be a lot of negativity sort of in the public, just the perception of marketing to people for these products.
Right.
Is that fair? And what's Horizon's approach to that?
Well, it's a fair perception. If I sat there and watched it, I think it would be reasonable to have that perception, Kyle. But if you look at the research, if you talk about direct to consumer, so let's make it simple. If you're seeing an ad for a medicine on a TV, what the research has showed is that has gone a long way to educating patients and giving patients then a voice to go in to talk to their doctor and say, hey, I want to take control of my care. I see this on the internet, or I see this ad, and I want to know more about this. So I want to have a better discussion, a more informed discussion with my physician. we're in a different world. It used to be where when I grew up, you go to your doctor, they tell you what to do, you take it, you leave, and that's how life works.
Yeah.
We're in a digital age where you have access to information everywhere. And the difference between the internet and watching a drug commercial is that drug commercial is highly regulated, and it has to be based on the label, and it has to share all the adverse events that go into the drug development. And the goal is to educate patients. If you look at our Tepezza, there's about let's call it a few million people who have Graves' disease, which is a disease of the thyroid. 40% of these patients in their lifetime can get the eye disease, or what's called thyroid eye disease. And that's where they get inflammation behind their eyes, and it starts pushing their eyes out of their socket. So you can't close your eyes. You get ulcers on your eyes dry out. You get disfigurement. You get double vision. People go on to blindness. They have to have very invasive surgeries where they cut out the orbital bone to try to get the eyes to go back in. Our medicine in clinical studies showed about 80% of those patients had a 2 millimeter, a reduction equivalent to what surgery would look like. So how do you get those patients who have Graves' disease, who don't even know this exists, or don't even know that there's an option to treat what they think is, hey, I've got just dry, watering eyes. I don't understand that could be a precursor to a much more serious disease. So if I'm watching a commercial, at least it gives me some information to ask my physician, maybe I have this. And if I do, maybe I can do something so that I can avoid getting it in the first place. The education aspect is the whole goal here. Now, obviously, it does improve the sales of a medicine, but it's doing in the context of making sure that the right medicine gets to the right patient.
I love that you shared that, because if you've never heard of it, how do you know what to ask for? And I imagine, especially when you're thinking about a primary care physician, there's a million different items or therapies or drugs on their mind. They're probably not going to remember every option for every patient they see. So that's a perspective I've never had.
And the goal is that you're creating that dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tim, I know that you were selected as a rare champion of hope by Global Genes last year, and I saw some of your tweets, and I know how much that meant to you. Can you just let our listeners know what that award means to you?
Well, I think it was just a recognition of what Horizon's done, what we've tried to do. We take a patient-centric approach. It's really important to me. We put the patient first, and I think it shows that companies can care and do the right thing. And it's a recognition of our 1,600 people and everything that they're doing every day to help patients get their medicine and to try to come up with some answers and help along the way.
Tim, you've been very generous with your time. We really, really appreciate you sitting down with us and just hashing through some of this, because like we discovered this whole series, the drug development process is not straightforward, and it takes many people coming together to figure out the best way to do these things. We're just grateful that you're in a position to influence the process in the way that you do and fighting for the patient. So we really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much. As a patient myself, I appreciate that. And we all have to keep fighting so that we all find options for ourselves, for our families, and our kids.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This has been a real pleasure.
Tim was so transparent. Sean, I hope you take him up on his offer to visit my life-size posters.
No, I don't think you heard him. I'm not going to visit your posters. I'm going to replace your posters, my friend.
Shots fired.
I appreciate Tim's articulation of so many things that go into drug pricing. We started a little bit with John Crowley, but Tim even went further, and I've never given consideration to how much the system plays into that. I've always been one of those people that in a sense, blame the drug company more than any other factor, and
Right,
Tim
yeah.
helped me see a larger and probably more accurate picture of the entire process, or the entire pie. So thank you, Tim, for being a part of our show today and helping close out this series. As always, we want to close out with some gratitude, our thank you notes. I'm going to begin with mine. Not too long ago, I shared with everybody that I bought a rollator, and it's been an incredible tool for me to get around. One thing I've noticed is how quick people are to offer, or at least ask, if I need help. Before the rollator, I think everybody just assumed I was drunk and I should be arrested. But now I feel like more people are more considerate to maybe grab the door or ask if I need help loading in the car or things like that. And I've seen that across the board with friends and with strangers. So I appreciate the power of that mobility device.
So, I realize you're appreciative of the people who offer help because of the roller, but also, are you annoyed that it takes the roller for them to be nice?
I mean, ultimately, yeah, but I guess I get it. It's just easy to assume
totally
I'm drunk, right? So, but yeah. Kyle, what do you got today?
My thank you is about the people on the bike trail that I passed yesterday during a 20-mile ride. And most people, it was a really nice day, so it's hard to be in a bad mood on a nice day out on the bike trail. But I appreciate just like the hello or the smile or whatever it is from people I'm passing, that kind of takes me back to the episode we did with Christina Boyer when she was saying the power of a smile, in her top 5, how your attitude can affect other people.
Sure.
Now, I do want to recognize that not every comment on the bike trail yesterday was very generous and nice. However, the nice comments far outweighed the negative ones.
Where did the negative ones come from? You don't have to say what they were, but were people mad that you were pedaling so fast, or what?
Well, it was just a close pass. Like there was people walking both directions, and then like we passed down the middle, and somebody makes a comment like, "Watch where you're going," or what,
Yeah.
So,
all right. Anyway.
Thanks for listening today. Please share this with a friend. Subscribe on all your favorite podcasts, all of them. Not just one, but all of them. Please subscribe, and until next time, keep living with urgency. Thank you for listening to the Two Disabled Dudes podcast. This show is possible with your support. Visit twodisableddudes.com to donate.
Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app.